In 1989, four friends went on a fishing trip and never came back. 12 years later, their boat was found in a swamp. It began on a Saturday in June, with the air thick and damp, the kind of Louisiana morning where the fog hangs so heavy it feels like a second skin. Four of them, boys on the edge of becoming men, had piled into an old pickup truck before dawn. Their names were Matt, David, Scott, and Brian. They were inseparable, their lives woven together since childhood, a bond forged over scraped knees, shared secrets, and hot summer days spent by the water. Matt was the steady one, the planner. David was the joker, always with a camera to capture their foolishness. Scott was quiet and intense, the best fisherman of the group. And Brian was the dreamer, the one who talked about getting out, seeing the world beyond their small town. Their parents watched them go, waving from front porches as the truck's red taillights disappeared into the mist. It was a familiar ritual, another weekend fishing trip, but this time was different. They were heading for a part of the Atchafalaya Basin they hadn't explored before, a place whispered about by old-timers, full of winding, unmarked waterways. They promised to be back by sundown. Sundown came and went. The sky turned from orange to purple to a deep, starless black. Porch lights stayed on all night. By morning, a quiet unease had turned into a sick, rising panic. Matt's father, John, was the first to call the sheriff. He tried to keep his voice even, but the tremor was there. He said, "My boy and his friends, they went fishing yesterday. They're not back yet." The search started within hours. Boats from the sheriff's department and the Wildlife Commission crisscrossed the main channels, their engines cutting through the oppressive silence. Volunteers from the town, friends and neighbors, joined in, walking the banks, calling their names until their throats were raw. They found the pickup truck parked at a remote boat launch, exactly where Matt said it would be. The doors were unlocked. A half-eaten bag of chips sat on the dashboard. But of the boat and the boys, there was no sign. For days, the search continued. The fog was their enemy. It rolled in thick every morning, limiting visibility to just a few feet. It clung to the cypress trees, dripping water that sounded like footsteps. The swamp seemed to swallow sound, swallow light, swallow hope. Divers went into the murky water, their lights barely penetrating the brown gloom. They found nothing. No wreckage, no clothes, no sign of a struggle. It was as if the boat, and the four young men inside it, had simply been erased from existence. After a week, the official search was scaled back. The town held a vigil. People prayed for a miracle. But as weeks turned into months, and months into years, the miracle never came. The story of the four missing fishermen became a local legend, a ghost story told to warn kids away from the deep swamp. The families were left in a state of suspended grief, trapped in a nightmare with no ending. They couldn't mourn because there was no proof of death. They couldn't hope because there was no sign of life. For 12 years, there was only silence, as thick and suffocating as the fog on the day they disappeared. The swamp kept its secrets, and the world moved on. But for four families, time stood still, waiting for an answer that never seemed to come. What really happened out there on the water? The question hung in the air, unanswered, a ghost in their quiet homes. 12 years is a long time. It's long enough for wounds to scar over, even if they never truly heal. It's long enough for a story to fade from headlines into folklore. By October of 2001, the town had mostly forgotten the specific, sharp pain of that summer in 1989. The missing boys were a sad chapter in the town's history, a memory that surfaced only occasionally, like an object rising from the bottom of a dark lake. That is, until a man named Al Landry went hunting. Al was in his late 60s, a man who had lived his whole life on the edge of the Atchafalaya Basin. He knew its rhythms, its dangers, and its hidden places. He preferred the parts of the swamp that others avoided, the tangled mazes where the water was black and the cypress knees looked like bones sticking out of the mud. On a cool autumn afternoon, he was tracking a deer deeper than he'd gone in years, following a barely there game trail that snaked through a dense thicket of tupelo and cypress. The air was still. The only sounds were the buzz of insects and the soft squelch of his boots in the mud. He was pushing through a curtain of Spanish moss when he saw it. At first, it didn't register. It was just a shape, something out of place in the riot of green and brown. It was a hard line where there should have been a curve, a patch of faded blue buried under a decade of vines and decay. Curiosity got the better of him. He waded closer, the water rising to his knees. He began to pull at the thick, woody vines that covered the object. They were tough, rooted deep into the thing itself. As he tore them away, more of the shape was revealed. It was the bow of a boat, a small aluminum fishing boat, tilted at a sharp angle, its stern swallowed by the swamp floor. It was almost completely hidden, tucked away in a shallow cove that was invisible from the main waterway just 100 yards away. You would never find it unless you were on foot, wading through the muck, exactly where Al was. His heart started to beat a little faster. Old boats were not uncommon out here, often abandoned or sunk in storms. But this one felt different. He continued to tear at the vegetation, his hands raw and dirty. He uncovered the side of the boat, and the peeling paint revealed letters. 4 letters were still visible. L-U-C-K. The rest were gone, scraped away by time and water. But Al didn't need to see the rest. He knew the boat. Everyone from that time knew the boat. It was the lucky day. He straightened up, his breath catching in his chest. He looked around at the silent trees and the dark water. The quiet of the swamp suddenly felt menacing. He was standing at a gravesite that had been lost for 12 years. For a long moment, he didn't move. The weight of the discovery pressed down on him. These boys weren't just a story. They were real, and this was where their story ended. He turned and began to make his way back, moving much faster now, leaving the half-submerged boat behind in its quiet tomb. He had to tell someone. After 12 years of silence, the swamp was finally starting to give up its secrets. The question was, what else was it hiding? The news spread through the town like a wildfire in a dry field. A single phone call from Al Landry to the sheriff's office was all it took. Within hours, the quiet corner of the swamp was swarming with people. Sheriff's deputies cordoned off the area with yellow tape, its bright color a violent slash against the muted greens and browns of the basin. The discovery of the boat was a shock, a relic from a past everyone thought was buried for good. It felt like digging up a coffin. A team from the forensics unit arrived, their clean white vans looking alien and out of place on the muddy track leading to the water. They brought in a portable pump and began the slow process of draining the water from the half-sunk vessel. It was a grim, methodical task. As the water level dropped, inch by inch, the inside of the boat was revealed. It was filled with a thick sludge of mud, leaves, and a decade's worth of decay. It smelled of rot and stagnant water. The first things they pulled out were the fishing rods. 4 of them, still resting in their holders along the side of the boat, coated in a fine layer of silt. Then came the tackle boxes. 2 of them, plastic and warped, but still latched shut. A detective, a man named Miller who was just a rookie back in 1989, pried one open. Inside, the lures were a tangled mess of hooks and rusted metal, but they were all there. It was eerily neat. Too neat. Next, they recovered a cooler. Inside, 3 cans of soda floated in the brown, foul-smelling water. It looked as if the boys had just stepped away for a moment, planning to come right back. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned gear, no damage to the boat itself, aside from the decay of time. It didn't make sense. If they had capsized in a storm, things would have been scattered everywhere. If they had run into a log, there would be a hole in the hull, but there was nothing. It was a scene frozen in time, a perfect, silent mystery. The search of the boat continued for hours. The team sifted through the sludge at the bottom, looking for anything that might offer a clue. A single waterlogged boot, a pocket knife, rusted shut. Small, personal items that only deepened the sense of loss. They were about to call it a day, concluding that the boat held no real answers, when one of the younger deputies noticed something tucked under a small, built-in seat at the bow. It was a metal box, the kind people used for cash or important papers. It was completely rusted, the lock fused shut by years in the water. It took 2 men and a crowbar to pry it open. Inside, nestled in a mess of slimy, decayed paper, was a camera. A cheap, disposable, waterproof camera, the kind David was never without. Miller picked it up carefully. It was heavy, still full of water. The plastic casing was cracked and yellowed. He looked at the other deputies. Everyone was thinking the same thing. Could the film inside have possibly survived for 12 years at the bottom of a swamp? It was a long shot, a 1 in a million chance. But in a case with no leads and no answers, a 1 in a million chance felt like a beacon of hope. Miller held the camera in his gloved hand. It was the first real piece of evidence in 12 years. He knew he was holding the boys' last moments. The only question was, what would they show? The news reached the families before it hit the papers. A knock on the door, a sheriff's car parked at the curb. For the parents of Matt, David, Scott, and Brian, it was the moment they had both dreaded and prayed for. The discovery of the boat was not a relief. It was an earthquake, shattering the fragile peace they had built over 12 years of not knowing. Matt's parents, John and Sarah, sat at their kitchen table, the same table where Matt had eaten breakfast on that last morning. John, a man whose grief had turned his hair gray and carved deep lines into his face, just stared at his hands. Sarah, however, looked directly at Detective Miller. Her eyes were sharp, demanding. "Tell me everything," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it held the strength of a woman who had refused to let her son become a ghost. Miller told them about the boat, its location, the condition of the gear inside. He spoke gently, choosing his words with care. He told them it looked as though the boys had simply vanished from the boat, leaving everything behind. Then he told them about the camera. Sarah's breath hitched. A camera? David always had that camera. Miller nodded. "We found it in a lockbox. It's on its way to a specialist lab in Baton Rouge. We're going to see if anything can be recovered from the film." He tried to manage their expectations. He said, "It's been underwater for a long time, Sarah. The chances are slim. Please, don't get your hopes up." But it was too late for that. Hope, once extinguished, had been reignited. It was a cruel, painful kind of hope. It meant revisiting the worst days of their lives, tearing open scars that had taken years to form. For the next few days, the 4 families lived in a state of suspended animation. They called each other constantly, sharing scraps of information, whispering theories. Did the boat run out of gas? Did they get lost and succumb to the elements? Every possibility was a new torment. Sarah found herself wandering into Matt's old bedroom. She had kept it exactly as he had left it. His baseball trophies on the shelf, his posters on the wall, a layer of dust covering everything like a shroud. She sat on his bed, the silence of the room pressing in on her. She had spent years trying to make peace with the not knowing. She had told herself that maybe he had run away, started a new life somewhere, that he was happy. It was a fantasy, a lie she told herself to get through the night. But the boat and the camera had destroyed that fantasy. The truth was waiting in that lab, on a thin strip of plastic. The waiting was an agony, far worse than the 12 years of silence had been. The silence was an absence, a void. This was a presence, a ticking clock counting down to a revelation that could bring either closure or a new, more terrible kind of pain. One afternoon, the phone rang. It was Miller. Sarah snatched it up before the first ring had finished. Her heart was pounding against her ribs. She heard the detective take a deep breath on the other end of the line. He said, "Sarah, we got the results from the lab. They were able to save some of the images." The specialist worked for 3 days in a dark room that smelled of chemicals and stale air. He treated the roll of film as if it were an ancient, priceless artifact. He painstakingly separated the fused layers, bathing them in a series of chemical solutions to stabilize the delicate emulsion. It was a miracle of forensic science that anything was salvageable at all. The first few frames that emerged from the final wash were ghostly but clear. There they were, the 4 boys, alive and smiling. The first shot was of Scott at the helm of the boat, a cocky grin on his face, the water calm behind him. Another showed Brian leaning back, eyes closed, soaking in the sun that had managed to break through the early morning fog. Then there was a picture of Matt, holding up a small catfish with a look of mock pride, David's shadow visible on the deck as he took the photo. They were just kids, having a good time, immortalized in cheap plastic and silver halide. For a moment, it seemed the camera would only offer a final, heartbreaking glimpse of their last happy hours. But then the mood of the photos began to change. The light grew dimmer. The fog, which had been a soft haze in the background, was now a thick white wall, pressing in on the boat from all sides. The smiles were gone. The next clear photo was of Scott, now staring out into the mist, his brow furrowed with concern. He was pointing at something just out of frame. The playful atmosphere was gone, replaced by a growing sense of unease. You could feel it in the grain of the image. You could almost feel the chill of the damp air. Then came the last clear photograph. It was a close-up of David's face. Except it wasn't a selfie. The angle was wrong. It was as if someone else had taken it, or the camera had been sitting on the console. David wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking past it, out into the fog. His eyes were wide. His mouth was a tight line of pure, undiluted fear. His hand was raised, his finger pointing directly at whatever he was seeing. It was a gesture of alarm, of warning. He was trying to show something to the person behind the camera. The very last frame was a chaotic blur. The image was streaked and tilted, as if the camera had been dropped or knocked aside in a sudden, violent motion. Most of the frame was an indecipherable mess of gray and white. But in the upper right corner, just for a split second, the lens had caught something. It was a shape. A dark, solid shape in the water, low against the fog. It was unnatural, out of place. It wasn't a log or a cypress knee. It was something else. Something with a hard edge. A defined form that the swamp should not contain. Detective Miller stared at the print of that final, blurry image. He felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The case had just been blown wide open. The boys weren't lost. They hadn't been the victims of a simple accident. They had seen something out there in the fog, something that terrified them. And whatever it was the key to the entire mystery. What was David pointing at? What was that dark shape lurking in the mist? The questions echoed in the sterile silence of the forensics lab, and Miller knew the answer would lead them down a much darker path than they had ever imagined. The photo changed everything. It went from being a cold case to an active, high-priority investigation overnight. The blurry image of the dark shape and the terrified look on David's face were printed, enlarged, and pinned to a board in the center of the incident room. For days, detectives and analysts stared at it, trying to pull a concrete answer from the grainy pixels. The official report from the state crime lab was frustratingly vague. They concluded the shape was unidentifiable due to motion blur and poor lighting. It could be anything: a large piece of driftwood, a shadow, an optical illusion created by the fog. But Detective Miller didn't buy it. He had spent his whole life in this part of Louisiana. He knew the shapes of the swamp. This was different. He brought in an independent photographic analyst, a man who specialized in enhancing old or damaged images. The analyst spent a week with the photo, running it through dozens of filters, sharpening the edges, adjusting the contrast. The final result was still blurry, but a detail emerged that had been invisible before: a straight, horizontal line at the top of the shape, and what looked like a dark, vertical line connected to it. "It looks like the gunwale of a boat," the analyst said, pointing to the screen. "A low-profile boat, like a skiff. And this vertical line? It could be anything, but it's consistent with an antenna, or maybe even a person standing, a boat." Suddenly, the old whispers from 1989 didn't sound so crazy. Back then, there had been rumors of drug smugglers using the remote parts of the basin to move their product. The talk had been dismissed at the time as local gossip. But now, with this photo, the theory took on a terrifying new weight. Miller started digging through the old case files, not just for the missing persons report, but for any major crimes in the region around June of 1989. He found it in the federal archives. A week after the boys disappeared, the DEA, acting on a tip, had intercepted a massive cocaine shipment on a highway about 60 miles north of the basin. The bust was huge, one of the biggest of the decade in that area, but they never caught the suppliers. The drivers they arrested refused to talk. The source of the shipment was listed as unknown, but the intelligence report suggested it had come into the country via the Gulf and been moved inland through the waterways. The timeline was too perfect to be a coincidence. Miller began to construct a new narrative, a dark and plausible scenario. The boys, lost in the fog, had taken a wrong turn. They had accidentally drifted into a quiet, secluded cove where a drug transaction was taking place. They had stumbled upon a ghost boat, a smuggler's skiff, loaded with millions of dollars worth of illegal drugs. The fear on David's face wasn't of some mythical swamp monster. It was the very real, very human fear of seeing something you were never meant to see. He was pointing at armed men who knew they had been discovered. The blurry final shot wasn't just the camera being dropped. It was chaos, a confrontation, a violent end to a day that had started with so much promise. The case was no longer just about 4 missing boys. It was now tied to a major drug trafficking operation. Miller picked up the phone and made a call to the regional FBI office. He needed their help, their resources. This was bigger than a local sheriff's department could handle. As he waited for the agent to answer, he glanced back at the photo of David. The boy's terrified eyes seemed to stare right at him, a silent plea from across the years. "We have to find them," Miller thought. "We have to find out what they did to you." Showing the photograph to the families was the hardest thing Detective Miller had ever had to do. He met with them one by one in the quiet of their living rooms, the same rooms that had served as waiting areas for 12 long years. He laid the glossy prints on their coffee tables, the smiling faces, the shifting fog, and then the final terrible image of David's fear. The reactions were a storm of renewed grief. To see their sons, not as smiling memories, but as they were in their last moments, afraid and in danger, was a special kind of cruelty. Brian's mother broke down sobbing, unable to look. Scott's father, a stoic man who hadn't shed a tear in public since the disappearance, simply stood up and walked out of the room. But Sarah, Matt's mother, did not cry. She picked up the photo of David. She held it close to her face, her fingers tracing the outline of his frightened expression. She stared at it for a long, silent minute. Miller explained the new theory, the drug smugglers, the skiff hidden in the fog. He told them it was the most likely explanation. It was a logical, horrifying answer to a question that had haunted them for over a decade. Most of the families seemed to accept it, the grim logic of it settling over them like a shroud. It was a terrible truth, but it was a truth nonetheless. It provided a framework for their loss, a reason, however senseless. But Sarah shook her head. "No," she whispered, still staring at the photo. "That's not it." Miller was taken aback. "Sarah, the evidence points strongly in this direction." She finally looked up from the picture, her eyes burning with an intensity that startled him. "You're a detective," she said. "You see evidence. I'm a mother. I see a child's face." The fear on that boy's face, it's not just about seeing bad men. It's something else. It's deeper than that. She refused to let it go. In the days that followed, she became consumed by the photograph. She had a copy made, a large one, and she would sit with it for hours, a magnifying glass in her hand, studying every grainy detail. She rejected the neatness of the drug deal theory. It felt too simple to explain the complete disappearance of 4 boys and their boat. The smugglers would have had to kill them, sink their boat, and dispose of 4 bodies, all without leaving a single trace. It seemed too clean, too perfect. One night, unable to sleep, she went into Matt's room, the room she had avoided for so long. She started going through his things, not sure what she was looking for. She opened his desk drawers, pulling out old school books, notebooks, forgotten trinkets. In the back of the bottom drawer, tucked beneath a stack of old magazines, she found a map. It was a detailed topographical map of the Atchafalaya Basin. It was worn and creased from being folded and refolded. And on it, in the deep, remote southern section of the swamp, far from any of the main channels and miles from where the boys were supposed to be fishing, was a small circle, drawn in red ink. She felt a jolt, a flash of recognition. She remembered Matt talking about it a few days before the trip, excited about some secret spot an old fisherman had told him about, a place where the fish were huge and no one ever went. At the time, she hadn't paid it much mind. But now, seeing it on the map, a cold dread washed over her. Why were they going there? It was a dangerous, unmarked part of the swamp. And it was miles away from where the authorities had found their boat. The boat wasn't where their journey ended. It was just a clue they had left behind. Their real destination, and their fate, lay somewhere else entirely, in a place marked only by a small red circle on an old map. Armed with Sarah's map and the FBI's resources, the investigation shifted its focus. The area circled in red ink was a place known to locals as the Cypress Maze, a labyrinth of identical-looking waterways and dead ends where even experienced boaters could get lost. It was the perfect place to hide something. A new search was organized, bigger and more sophisticated than any that had come before. They established a command post at the edge of the swamp, a temporary city of trailers and tents. This time, they weren't just looking for a boat, they were looking for evidence of a crime scene. The teams went in at dawn. The air was cool and the water was like glass, reflecting the towering cypress trees perfectly. But the beauty of the place was deceptive. It was eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the hum of their boat engines and the calls of unseen birds. The search area was vast, and the work was slow and frustrating. They used side-scan sonar, towing a device called a fish behind their boats, which sent out pulses of sound to map the bottom of the bayou. For 2 days, the sonar screen showed nothing but the contours of the muddy floor, the ghostly shapes of submerged logs, and the occasional piece of junk. The mood at the command post grew tense. Resources were being stretched thin, and some of the federal agents were beginning to doubt that there was anything to find. Miller and Sarah, who had insisted on being present, watched the screens with a shared intensity. Sarah pointed to a specific part of the sonar map. "Here," she said, "this bend in the water. It looks like the place on Matt's map." Miller directed the sonar boat to make another pass over the area, a deep, slow-moving channel where the water was nearly 50 feet deep. They watched the screen as the boat moved. A line appeared, showing the muddy bottom. Then, another shape began to form. It was long and rectangular. It wasn't a log. It had hard, defined edges. It was man-made. "Got something," the sonar operator said, his voice cutting through the tension. "A significant metallic object, about 15 feet long, deep in the silt." Miller felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. The location was right. The size was right. It had to be the smuggler's skiff. The next challenge was getting to it. The object was buried under at least 5 feet of mud and black water. They called in a team of professional divers, specialists in low-visibility recovery operations. The 2 divers, clad in heavy gear, slipped over the side of the boat and disappeared into the opaque water. On the surface, everyone waited. The only link to the men below was the stream of bubbles rising to the surface and the crackle of the comms unit. For what felt like an eternity, there was only the sound of breathing and the muffled noise of the divers working in the mud below. Then, a voice crackled through the speaker. "We found it. It's a boat. A flat-bottomed skiff. It's been deliberately sunk. There are concrete blocks tied to it." The voice paused. "And there's something else down here. The hull is damaged. It looks like there was some kind of collision. Or a fight. We're going to try to get inside." The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. They were on the verge of knowing the truth. The divers were not just exploring a sunken boat. They were entering a tomb, one that had held its secrets for 12 long years. The divers worked for hours in the cold, black water. They described a scene of controlled chaos on the sunken skiff. The inside was a mess of rotted rope, concrete blocks, and mud. But as they carefully sifted through the debris, the story of what happened began to emerge. They found the remnants of what had clearly been a large drug shipment. Burlap sacks, rotted and empty, were wedged under the seats. The DEA confirmed they were identical to the ones seized in the highway bust, back in 1989. This was the boat. This was the scene of the crime. The divers then found something that made the blood run cold. Near the stern, half buried in the silt, was a length of heavy chain and a single rusted handcuff. There had been prisoners on this boat. But the most damning discovery came from inside a small, watertight compartment that had been forced open. Inside, preserved from the water, was a wallet. It was made of cheap leather, warped and stained, but the contents were intact. The driver's license inside belonged to a man named Rico Vargas. Miller recognized the name instantly. Vargas was a known enforcer for a cartel, a violent man with a long rap sheet, who had also vanished without a trace in the summer of 1989. The FBI had long suspected he was involved in the shipment that was busted, but they could never prove it. Now they knew why he disappeared. He was on this boat. The picture was finally clear, and it was more brutal than anyone had imagined. The boys, lost in the fog, had not just stumbled upon a drug deal. Their fishing boat, the Lucky Day, had physically collided with the smuggler's skiff in the dense fog. The damage on the skiff's hull matched the profile of their boat's bow. It was a tragic accident that had escalated into a nightmare. There was a confrontation. The boys saw the drugs. They saw the faces of the men. Rico Vargas and his associate could not afford witnesses. The fear on David's face was real. He was pointing at a man with a gun. The last blurry photo from his camera wasn't just him dropping it. It was the moment of impact, the moment the two boats hit, the moment their fate was sealed. The smugglers, their operation compromised, had acted with ruthless efficiency. They had taken the boys captive. The single handcuff was terrifying proof. What they did next was left to grim speculation. There were no bodies, not in the skiff, not in the surrounding water. The most likely scenario was the most horrifying one. The smugglers had taken the boys, chained them, and sunk them somewhere in the vast, deep waters of the basin where they would never be found. Then they scuttled their own boat, took the boys' boat, and staged it in the shallow cove miles away. A decoy, a false trail to send search parties in the wrong direction. They wanted it to look like the boys had simply gotten lost and wandered off. And for 12 years, it had worked. The truth was not a swamp monster or a ghost story. It was colder and far more human. It was the story of 4 boys who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, who paid the ultimate price for a chance encounter in the fog. The case was closed, but it was never solved. Rico Vargas's partner was never identified. No arrests were ever made. The men responsible for the deaths of Matt, David, Scott, and Brian simply vanished, likely having fled the country with the portion of the shipment that didn't get busted. There would be no justice, no day in court, no satisfaction of seeing the guilty punished. There were only answers, and the answers provided no comfort. The parents were left with a story that was complete but offered no resolution. Their sons' bodies were never recovered from the swamp. The basin, which had been the backdrop of their childhoods, was now their unmarked grave. The town held a memorial service. This time, it wasn't a vigil for the missing. It was a funeral for the dead. The names of the 4 boys were etched onto a simple stone monument placed in the town square. A few weeks later, Detective Miller drove to John and Sarah's house. He carried a small cardboard box. He sat with them in their living room, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. He handed the box to Sarah. "It's the original photos," he said. "And the camera. I thought you should have them." Sarah opened the box. She looked at the pictures one last time, the smiling faces, the carefree joy, then the fear. She saw it all now, the entire story contained in those few frames. She saw the collision in the blurry final shot, the terror in David's eyes as he looked at a man who was about to end his life. She quietly closed the box. She didn't need to look at them anymore. The mystery was gone, and in its place was only the hard, unchangeable fact of her loss. The truth hadn't brought closure. Closure was a myth. The truth had simply replaced a question mark with a period, a final, brutal end to the sentence of their lives. She carried the box to Matt's room and placed it in the back of his closet, behind his old shoes and forgotten jackets. She closed the door, leaving the last moments of her son's life in the darkness. The fog on the water had finally lifted, revealing a horror far worse than any mystery. But the emptiness remained, a quiet, hollow space, in their home and in their hearts. The swamp had given up its secrets, but it had kept the boys. And it would keep them forever, silent beneath the dark water, a permanent part of the wild, lonely place where their journey ended. Have you ever heard of a story like this, one that stays with you long after it's over? Share your thoughts or similar experiences in the comments.